I'm here with screenwriter and novelist, Emmy winner, Golden Globe winner, GLAD winner, Mark B. Perry. How are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you, Ryan?
Excellent. Thank you so much, and I appreciate you for joining me. I went to
Happy to be here.
your book signing, introducing Dexter Gaines, your new book, and I was really impressed by the book. Can you talk a little bit? I was like reading your bio, and you grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. What was it like growing up in Atlanta?
Well, I was glad to be growing up in the suburbs of Atlanta because it's like a little patch of sanity in Georgia. I mean, I'm a Georgia boy, but I'm glad I had the advantages of the city right by there. And so what was it like growing up in Atlanta? It was pretty much like The Wonder Years, the show that I started writing in the suburbs. So
Yeah, The Wonder Years is one of my favorite shows. I enjoy watching that so much as a child, and I feel that it really uh was about family, and like now I feel like when you watch television, a lot of it is like based around sex. Everything's like so much like they focus on sex. But what I liked about The Wonder Years, it was just like about like this is like some of the things that you go through and these issues. It wasn't really so heavy handed, and you got your job like writing on Wonder Years, like writing a spec script, like
yeah.
and they actually used the spec script. How unbelievable was that at the time?
It blew my mind. I mean, I wasn't even gonna when I finished the spec script, I wasn't gonna submit it. I didn't think it was good enough because I was so in awe of the Wonder Years. And my then wife, she said, if you don't send it, I will send it. And I was like, okay. So I submitted it to my agent who sent it to the Wonder Years and they asked me to come in and pitch. And I was so green. My response to that was pitch what? And she said, ideas for episodes. And I said, well, I don't have any. I wrote the one that I had. And she said, well, you better come up with some by next Thursday. So I scrambled. I came up with some pitches. I went in, I got a pitch, I got a freelance assignment, and I wrote that. And then I waited and I waited and I waited. And I thought, well, I had my shot. And then they called and said, come be on staff. And then they brought me on staff. And my first day there, with all of these Emmy nominated writers, the showrunner called me in his office and said, "Oh, by the way, we're buying your spec script. It's going to be the season opener." So, it was like, okay, I guess maybe the script was not bad. So, and that really started everything for me. And what was so special about it was I loved that show before I even tried to write an episode. I had fallen so in love with it. And I thought, oh, I there was something that happened to me when I was 14 that I could write about. And, the show was really about those universal experiences. It's like getting up the nerve to call a girl, or, you're going to go to something and you've got your first pimple. It's like those big crises that, in retrospect are small, but everybody can relate to them. And the other thing is you mentioned that you watched it as a kid and you really enjoyed the show. That was the universal appeal of that show, was that it was from an adult point of view looking back. But it also appealed to kids because the most of the protagonists in the show were kids. And I spoke at my elementary school when the show was like at its height of popularity. And one little girl asked me, she raised her hand and she said, "Why do they wear funny looking clothes on the show?" And so I had to explain to her that it was a period piece, and I realized I'm talking to like an 11-year-old. I don't know if I'm going to convey this concept properly. But anyway, so enough about that. I tend to go on and on. Sorry.
That's incredible. And you ended up racking up 18 writing credits. Can you talk a little bit about just your time writing on the show and what you enjoyed about it?
What I enjoyed about it was, like I said, it was getting to write about universal experiences. And also, I got to write some episodes that also dealt with the parents and his older sister who was going through, all of the things that kids were going through in the late 60s and early 70s. And it was a fun atmosphere. There were a lot of really talented writers, and I was learning with some of the best. I met one of my best friends and my mentor, Jill Gordon, on that show, and we are still close to this day, and we've worked together several times on other projects. Um, and it was also very satisfying to be on a show that you knew people were watching and that it was touching people and meaning something to them. And I learned a lot about story and dialogue and just producing television. And the cast was lovely. The actors were all just such a joy to work with.
That's amazing. And just like I feel like that having like a moment like that as your first moment for like a television show, because like I feel like a lot of writers, they don't necessarily get the opportunity where their spec script gets actually used on like a hit television show. Moving forward, you worked on some like pretty amazing shows. Can you talk a little bit about like after you left the Wonder Years and how was it like getting working?
Well, um, what happened was when I was on the Wonder Years for 3 seasons, and I decided to leave before the last season, and they kind of knew it was going to be the last season, season 6. And I thought at that point I had kind of written everything I had to say about being an adolescent or a teenager. And my agent said, do you want to, you're coming off of a dramedy, The Wonder Years. It's funny and it's dramatic. Do you want to go into comedy or do you want to go into drama? Now, some of the writers on The Wonder Years were comedy writers, and I had heard enough horror stories about being on comedy shows where they work you until 4 in the morning and you have to sit around a table and be funny. And I thought, I don't write jokes, I write humor. And I thought, I don't want to do that. So I said, let me try drama. So to his credit, this was back, the business was so different back then. You were talking about writing a spec script for a show. I don't even think people do that anymore. I think most writers who are trying to get in the business are writing original spec material, like original spec pilots and that sort of thing. But back then, there was a very limited market, very few shows that would actually read spec scripts that were written for their shows. And then I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But anyway, my agent, he introduced me to uh, Schneider and Froloff, who were running a show called Northern Exposure on CBS, which was a critical darling. And I got a freelance assignment to write an episode of Northern Exposure. And I didn't know it at the time, but it was what we called an audition script. And that was, if you wrote a good script, then they would probably they'd offer you a staff position. I thought I wrote a good script, but they didn't offer me a staff position. So, but but what it did give me was an hour-long sample of a show and a credit because they did produce the episode. They rewrote it and they produced it. And so it gave me that credit. And then that opened the door with David E. Kelley, who was doing his first solo show, which was Picket Fences, also on CBS. And he hired me to on the first season of that show. I learned a lot from him. And then from there, I went on a show called Moon Over Miami, and then I went to Law and Order for a while. Did not like that experience because that show is so cut and dried, and I have to put humor in everything I do, and so I really felt like I was handcuffed on that show. And then just, I've been very fortunate to one thing would lead to another. And I was at a point where I knew enough people and had enough friends that if they got a show, they would call. That's how I ended up on Revenge, which was one of the most fun experiences I've had for the first 2 seasons of that show. Um, but yeah, I owe a lot to that I can't really call it an overnight success because I put a lot of work into writing scripts before I finally got a break on the Wonder Years. But I have to give a lot of credit to that first show, opening a lot of doors for me.
Yeah, most definitely. And I love like a lot of the shows you mentioned. I've watched Picket Fences as a child. That was really an amazing show. Don Cheadle. And I enjoyed that show. Me and my mom would watch that. I remember I think it used to come on Saturdays on CBS, but it was like a great show. And
Yeah.
you say in your bio, like, that Law and Order sometimes gets you excused from jury duty.
It's true. They say, "What do you do for a living?" I say, "I'm a TV writer." I think now I'm going to say I'm a novelist, but I say I'm a TV writer, and they say, "Well, have you written for any legal shows?" And I go, "Well, yeah, the I've written for Law and Order." And then they're like, "This juror is excused." And I don't know why that is, but for some reason, although it didn't work once, there was one time I was sent to Pasadena and the prosecutor intentionally chose me because I had worked on Law and Order. And I found that out because I met him after the trial, where I ended up as an alternate juror, and I met with him after the trial. I wanted to develop a pilot about him because he was completely blind. And he was working as a very successful prosecutor in Los Angeles.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. Did you write the pilot, or like what happened with that?
I, well, this is horrible to say. I couldn't sell it because the response that I got, and remember, this was before streaming, so this was when there were four networks basically, and maybe HBO. But uh, the response was universal that basically they were uncomfortable doing a show about someone with a disability, which I thought was horrible, especially since there are there was a show years ago, I think it was called Long Street, back in the 70s, about a blind private investigator. And then there was Ironsides about, a detective in a wheelchair. I was like, that's ridiculous. But, trends come and go, things change in the business. But at that time, it was just the wrong time. But I got to meet the guy and spend some time with him backstage at the courthouse, which was really, really interesting.
How important is resilience? Because I imagine like being a writer, pitching these ideas, like, having this idea that you believe in and you think is great. And then, like, it's not like today where, pretty much anyone who wants to make a film can, but like, in those years, it was a lot harder. So can you talk a bit about like, the rejection and just like overcoming that adversity?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. It's certainly a challenge. It's one thing to work in series, to get steady jobs, as staff writer, executive producer, supervising producer, story editor, what have you. But selling pilots is a whole different thing, and I don't have a great track record with that. There was always something. It was I wrote some pretty high profile pilots, but they didn't go for various reasons beyond my control. And it's one of the reasons I decided I wanted to get into fiction because, I get to be the boss, I get to be in control, and I get to determine what the story is and who the characters are and how they behave and all of that stuff.
Introducing Dexter Gaines, it's like, it seems like, just a really interesting book. I haven't read it, but like I went to the book signing and I'm definitely going to. I felt like that is really interesting because it's a period piece. And you talked about like, doing research, and including like, real characters, for this fictional character. Can you talk a little bit about just like writing the book and some of the challenges?
Well, I was drawn to write the book because I am a big fan of old Hollywood. I love old movies. I love classic movies. And after working on some of the studio lots, my first job in Los Angeles in the business was I was a temp. I got a job as I got a position as an office temp, and they sent me around, and I ended up at 20th Century Fox in the legal department, and I was working as a legal assistant there, but it got me on the lot. And I was so starstruck to be on a real movie lot. And it still had the sets standing from Hello Dolly from the 60s. And, so it felt like a real movie studio. And the last year I worked there was when Fox Plaza opened, which is the Nakatomi Plaza building from Die Hard. And we moved our offices into that building while they were filming Die Hard. So I would be on the phone with people and you would hear machine gun fire coming up through the stairwells and the elevator shafts. But I've been in love with old Hollywood. I wanted to write something set in that world. And I'm a big fan of historical fiction, and I really appreciate verisimilitude. And when, a writer can really make you feel like you're in a time and place and that the characters are real, no matter how ridiculous it is, whether it's a fire-breathing dragon or, Rock Hudson, a movie star. And so I thought, I wanted to use some real people. There's obviously fictional characters. They're the main characters in the book, but they do interact quite a bit with actual movie stars and producers and directors from the era. And I wanted to make sure that I was respectful of those people. They've all passed, and I didn't want to malign anybody. And so I wanted to try to get their voices as accurate as I could. And it also helps that I love to read celebrity biographies from that period and books about the movie business. And I think that really helped. There's some great books about, Tallulah Bankhead actually is a supporting character in the book. And people have never really heard of her now, but this woman was so famous in her day. There are 8 biographies written about her, including her own autobiography, which came out in 1952 and is actually mentioned in the book because that's one of the years where part of the action takes place. But I did a lot of research. I talked to people at the Academy of Motion Pictures and their library. I talked to the UCLA Film and Television Archive. They were very helpful, and it was really fun to do the research while I was writing the book. Um, and I wanted to shine a light on it's the 1950s, which was a very different time in a lot of ways and not that different in a lot of other ways. And I was drawn to that time period with these characters. So, and it was fun. It was really fun to be able to write something where, I didn't have to answer to uh, producers and studio executives and so forth.
Yeah, that sounds really amazing. And you talk about Tallulah Bankhead, and she seems like a very interesting figure. Some people who may know her from like the Alfred Hitchcock movie Lifeboat, and you talked about her being like really famous. What was it about her particularly that drew you to her, and like that you became obsessed with her?
When I was a kid, I was homesick one day, and during the day, they used to run reruns of things like I Love Lucy and My Favorite Martian and that kind of thing. And I remember I was homesick. I was watching our little black and white TV, and there was the Lucy Desi Comedy Hour episode, which excerpts of it are on YouTube, where Tallulah Bankhead was the guest star playing herself. In the show, Lucy and Desi had moved to Connecticut or somewhere. They were like, they had like their country house or whatever. And Tallulah Bankhead moved into the house next door in this episode. Originally, it was supposed to be Betty Davis, but I think she hurt her back and she fell out, and they got Tallulah as a replacement. But she's outrageously funny in the episode. I mean, she's just, you have to watch the clips. It's hard to explain. Um, but she's very funny. And I was fascinated by her. And then I remember at some point catching the last movie she ever made, which was sort of a schlock hammer horror movie called Die, Die, My Darling, with Stephanie Powers. And it was one of Donald Sutherland's early first movies. And I've just been obsessed with her. And I've read all of those biographies. And I've always wanted to I tried pitching a biopic about her, but the response was, well, nobody's really heard of her. And I thought, well, if we make the biopic, they will have heard of her. But nobody listens to me. So I put her in the book, and I had fun writing her voice, which is very distinctive. And but that's how I ended up with that. And then I'm not obsessed with David Ocel, Daryl F. Zanuck, who was the head of 20th Century Fox for decades. But I read a book by the director Jean Negulesco, and he wrote his memoir about his time in Hollywood, and I was fascinated by the way he wrote about Daryl Zanuck and the parties that Zanuck had at his Palm Springs estate. And so I thought, well, this will be fun to put Zanuck in, who was famously believed that television was just going to be a fad and it would go away. And it was, and they just needed to make bigger movies to keep people from watching TV, and then TV would die and it would just go back to business as usual. Of course, he was colossally wrong about that, but here we are.
Most definitely. What would you say is the biggest difference from writing a screenplay to writing a novel?
The freedom, just the absolute freedom of not, there's so many chefs when TV and film, very collaborative. They're very collaborative. And I love that. I love collaboration. I love being in a writer's room and if you've got a better idea, bring it. I love that. But it was exciting to sit down and I didn't know if I could do it or not. I just thought, okay, I'm going to try this. I've always wanted to do this, but I've always been a little bit intimidated. But I feel like I've told enough stories in television and I know how to write shorthand and I know how to write dialogue. And so I gave it a shot. And then the more I did it, the more I loved it because I didn't, the, you know, the only person second guessing me was me, and I was already used to that anyway. So that's it was liberating and very fun. But I would say it's the freedom of not having to stay within a page count, not having to keep your action passages a certain length, um, not having to change things because the producers come back and say we can't afford to shoot it this way. Uh, Sky's the limit, and there's no budget on your imagination.
Yeah, that's really incredible because obviously, like, when you're writing a screenplay, like that's something that you have to take into consideration. You can't, obviously go over budget and like, it limits your imagination in a way. I guess like, I went to film school and I know like sometimes there's like people like they'd have like these creative ideas and like well like that's gonna cost like what I mean a lot of a lot of money to shoot like that particular way and then some people would get upset like because like they feel like oh like it's like I'd rather just wait till like I have the money to be able to shoot this because I want to shoot it this way like and not want to like limit your creative vision being someone who like writes screenplays and having seen like the success of like people who wrote books like George R. R. Martin for instance he did
Mhm.
Game of Thrones that started with books. Do you feel that that's kind of going to be the wave now like where screenplay writers write books and they become movies later on?
I think it's entirely possible. And to be perfectly honest, it's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was so that if the book gets an audience, then I would love nothing more than to sell it as a limited series and produce it, for Netflix or Hulu or HBO or whoever. But there's an obsession with intellectual property, and everybody says that's what everybody's looking for is big IP, something that's already been proven to be successful. Um, and I think, I have heard of people thinking about turning screenplays that they wrote that they never sold, having turning them into graphic novels or writing the novel version of those screenplays as for precisely the reason that you bring up. So I think it is definitely a possibility that we're going to see more of that. And hey, if it gets people to read, that's even better. So
It wasn't that long ago 2023 the Writers Guild went on strike. And
yeah.
I remember, like, just like one of the main issues was AI. And I was on the picket line because I'm a member of SAG. And so, like, talking to them, I remember, like, like one of the issues that they were concerned about, particularly was AI. Do you feel like, that the writer strike was successful, that you guys got like, what you wanted out of it?
I think we did and we didn't because I do hear that AI is being used in some limited ways. Um, and but we did get some concessions on staffing and so forth. The real problem right now, Ryan, is that the business model has changed so much that, when I started, network shows had orders of 22, 24 episodes, and a successful show at the end of the year, you knew you were coming back. And if they picked you up as a writer to stay on the show, you went on vacation, and then you came back. But now, because of, shows have 6 episodes, 8 episodes, 13 maybe, uh, it's a lot harder for people to A, make a living, and B, get the kind of experience that they need of actually not just writing a show, because when you're on a show, you need to get involved in helping produce the show and learning, you know, how to behave on set, how to talk to actors, how to talk to directors, how to get what you want from producers in the studio and the network, how to work with an editor, because that's where, the final rewrite of everything is done is in the editing room. And that's invaluable experience that's really only available on the job. I mean, yes, you can go to school and everything, but it's not the same as the real world applications for it. So, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon unless the streaming industry just suddenly collapses, which I don't see happening because, they're making too much money. But it's different. And, it used to be that, young writers starting out would say, "Hey, can we go to coffee and let me pick your brain?" And I would say yes, but now I don't have anything to give them because I don't know how it works anymore. I don't know what you have to do as a young person trying to get into this business the way it is now, that it's so fragmented with all the scripted shows. And then there's this paradox of I keep hearing about all the scripted shows, and then there's no production. I know, granted, a lot of it is being done overseas, and that's to save money. And I know that they're trying to do something to bring it back, but it's very different now than it was. And yeah,
That brings up an interesting point because Trump, he's started this movie tariff, and he's basically wants people to film in the U.S. So he wants to tax films like productions that are filming overseas. Do you think that'll work?
I have no idea. My brain doesn't function on that level. And I, I, I think the way to bring the business back here is with to have the kind of tax incentives and tax breaks here that they offer in other places. I mean, think about it. If moving an entire show to Budapest is cheaper and that's transportation, that's accommodations for everybody that, I guess I hate this expression, but above the line, everybody above the line on the crew. Um, that's it's amazing that it must be that much cheaper than it is here. And if we can't figure out a way to make it more appealing here, then I think it's going to continue to head out. And I just heard the other day that even Atlanta now, which it was booming, I've heard that it's struggling to keep production there as well. So something has to happen. Whether it's tariffs, I really couldn't say.
For sure. What's next for you?
Well, I am working on my next bit of fiction, which is I've written the first two in a trilogy, and it's a complete change of pace from Dexter Gaines. It's a comedic, cozy murder mystery trilogy, which is basically a murder and a whodunit in the books. But because I do love historical fiction, each one is set in a real historical place or context. And there are some real life characters, same as in Dexter. There are, real life celebrities, real life public figures who weave in and out of the action. Um, and I'm calling it so far. It's the Murder Darling Mysteriella's because they're very short. I'm thinking of them as like I think they would be the perfect airport book because you could read one mystery on a flight from LA to New York or wherever. But that's what I'm working on. And then, I've got a couple of other things in television that I'm still keeping the irons in the fire with that. But right now, I've just been really enjoying writing fiction. And the feedback on the book so far has been great. I was blown away. Since it debuted last Tuesday. It's still on the Amazon bestseller list for LGBTQ
Congratulations.
historical fiction. And, I have issues with Amazon, like most people do. And I've encouraged people, if you're going to buy the book, I've been telling people to buy it from their local indie bookstore and support them. But I'm grateful that, Amazon has this. And, it's certainly I posted something about being thrilled and humbled, but I didn't know what the word for that was. And then my friend Nancy Sullivan wrote a comment and said thrumbled. So I'm thrumbled by that. Uh, so yeah, I'm having fun with fiction, but I'm open to television. If, something comes along or if I get something going, I'll be doing that again.
Is there a show that you would love to write for right now? Like, if you any show that you would, if you could, like, just had like a magic wand or a Santa Claus wish list.
I think right now where I am, uh, I'm not sure that there is, but if I was going to be on a staff, I think it would, I, I think The Studio, Seth Rogen's show on Apple, maybe Hacks, um, but mostly I think I want to try to get my own things going now. I'm at that point in life, so that's what I want to be doing.
Right. A lot of people who have been in the industry, that seems to be a mindset that evolves because it seems like, the people in the studios are the ones who are somehow making all the money while, like, people like you, do all the work. Do you feel like, something needs to change, like, where the people who do the work, like, are making, like, a little bit more money and getting a little bit more of a share of it?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. If there's, and if there's a model where that works, the problem is everything's been so corporatized and everything is about pleasing the shareholders and the bottom line. And, you know, occasionally people take chances on shows, but a lot of times they don't. They want to do the safe thing because they're trying to protect the bottom line and trying to do it as cheaply as possible. That's why we're sending people to Budapest and other places, New Zealand or wherever. And but yeah, I think across the board, not just in the entertainment industry, but pay a living wage, pay people a living wage. I absolutely.
Do you see yourself doing a follow up to introducing Dexter Gaines? Because I know, like, that there's been a good reception for it, and it seems like people really love the novel. Do you see yourself following up?
I don't know. I haven't really thought about it because to me that story has kind of been told. The only, I did think at some point there is an opportunity if I thought there was a market for it and if I felt so inclined to take one of the other characters. The book is told in the first person from Dexter. His real name isn't Dexter. That's the name they come up with for him with the studio system. But it's his point of view. He's the one telling the story. And, I thought there could be a book about some of the other characters that because there's great chapters of their life that aren't covered in the book that could be done. But I don't know. I kind of like letting Dexter just sort of be Dexter and have that story begin and be told and end where it does.
Being such an accomplished writer and having won awards, what do you find, like, that keeps you going, like, and still writing today?
Just the desire to tell stories. That's something I've had since I was a kid. I told this story at the event at Book Soup, but I had a third grade teacher who inspired me, to want to be a writer. And I've wanted that ever since. And then on top of that, the Dick Van Dyke Show, I saw that on TV, and that's about an aspiring novelist who's working in television. And they had scenes with him in his writer's room with Rosemary and Maury Amsterdam. And I thought, wow, so that's a job. These people get paid, and because they were having a lot of fun and cracking jokes. And I thought, people get paid to do that. And I knew I wanted to write stories, and then I became obsessed with film and television, and mostly because of television as a kid. And then I got into movies, and I was going to when I was in college, I would go to the Repertory Cinema and watch all the old movies. And then when I was living in Atlanta, there was a theater there called the Silver Screen, and it was a repertory house, and they showed old movies, and I would go to the matinees and watch double features of Casablanca and To Have and Have Not, and just fell in love with it. Uh, so it's the desire to tell stories. And the other thing, and I know that I don't want to sound corny about this, but I do feel like storytellers serve a function in society. It's like the Wonder Years touched a lot of people. And I think if you can write things that people can relate to and empathize with, it's good for the humanity in all of us, I think. And God knows we need distractions right now. We need to be entertained. We don't want to lose sight of the world, but we need to escape sometimes and be entertained.
Definitely. And I salute you. Thank you so much for taking the time and like all the work that I've enjoyed that you've written over the years. I think like, that you're doing a great thing in introducing Dexter Gaines, a novel of old Hollywood. I recommend everybody like, watching this interview to check it out. And, just like, thank you so much. It was like really great, like, to meet you and your partner as well. And like, I appreciate you for coming on.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I was excited that when I saw you at the book event, because I thought it was all just going to be my friends showing up, and I was like, "Hey, somebody came who doesn't know me."
For sure,
So
for sure.
yeah, and I'm glad you reached out, and I'm very happy to do this. So thank you.
You're welcome. Have a great day. Thank you. I
All right,
appreciate you.
stay in touch.
Most definitely.
All right, thanks.